Think 20th century dictator, you see a common template. It involves a coup or civil war to gain power. Then a wave of purges to maintain that power. A manufactured cult of personality often follows. A secret Swiss bank account is usually involved. A lavish palace with everything gold-plated is typical. And crucially, an escape plan for when things collapse. Hitler gets put into this category automatically, simply because he was a dictator. But here's the really strange part. By nearly every measure historians use, Hitler didn't just break the template. He was actually the opposite. He was legally handed power. He never purged his closest inner circle. He named no successor. He built no dynasty. He outright refused exile. He ordered the destruction of his own country. And he shot himself in a basement at only 56 years old. Every other dictator on that list aimed to survive. Hitler wanted the exact opposite. And that single inversion is the key to understanding almost everything people misunderstand about the Third Reich. All the other names on that list fought their way to power. Every single one of them did. Stalin spent decades maneuvering within the Bolshevik Party, outmaneuvering rivals at every funeral. Mao waged a civil war across an entire continent. Mussolini marched on Rome leading an army of black shirts. Franco initiated a military coup that ravaged Spain for 3 years. Castro spent 2 years in the Sierra Maestra leading a guerrilla insurgency. Kim Il-sung was physically installed in Pyongyang by the invading Red Army. They all paid the typical price for that job: violence, exile, prison, or all three. Hitler paid none of that. On January 30, 1933, the Weimar Republic's own president, Paul von Hindenburg, appointed him chancellor following a backroom agreement brokered by the former chancellor, Franz von Papen. No coup, no civil war, no aggressive march occurred. As historian Ian Kershaw stated, Hitler was brought into power by conservative elites who believed they could easily control him. They were mistaken, but the process was entirely constitutional. And the situation only worsened from there. The Reichstag didn't just fail to stop him in the following weeks. It voluntarily dissolved its own legislative authority, passing the Enabling Act with a vote of 441 to 94. The German parliament legally signed away German democracy, on paper, with a supermajority vote. Within just 53 days of his appointment, Hitler had been granted dictatorial authority by the very institution meant to restrain him. No other 20th century dictator was simply handed the keys by the body designed to oppose him. Once he was in power, surely he did what all dictators do. He violently eliminated rivals to secure absolute power. That's the common assumption. And that is also incorrect. Hitler's inner circle in 1933, containing most of its key figures, remained his inner circle until 1945. Hermann Göring had been by his side since 1922. Joseph Goebbels joined in 1926, and Heinrich Himmler in 1923. Bormann, Speer, Ribbentrop, Rosenberg, the same faces, the same names, the same men 12 years later. 2 exceptions actually confirm this pattern. Ernst Röhm, the SA leader, was executed during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. This was a single strike against a rival paramilitary group, resulting in an estimated 85 to 200 deaths. And Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, flew himself to Scotland in 1941 on an unauthorized solo peace mission. This was an exit, not a purge. Now, compare this to Stalin. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 executed approximately 750,000 people in just 2 years. It eliminated nearly every original Bolshevik, the men who had made the revolution alongside Lenin. They were dragged into courtrooms, forced to confess to fabricated crimes, and shot in the back of the head in Lubyanka basements. It impacted the Red Army so severely on the eve of the most destructive war in human history that 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and 8 out of 9 admirals were eliminated. Stalin decimated his own military because he feared his generals more than Hitler. Hitler himself never took such actions. He trusted his team, or more accurately, he never perceived his team as a threat because the team was never the central focus. The reason for this, rather than any sign of loyalty or leniency, becomes even stranger the more you investigate. If you're finding this deep dive into one of the Third Reich's most unusual paradoxes engaging, please hit subscribe. The darkest aspects are yet to come. Here's where the stability began to crumble, and where the strangeness becomes impossible to ignore, starting from 1938 and especially after December 1941, when he dismissed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch and took personal command of the army. Hitler managed the war himself. He directed it down to the level of individual divisions, specifying exactly where the pins went on the map in the Wolf's Lair. No other leader in the Second World War did this. Stalin, despite his paranoia, delegated tasks to Zhukov and Vasilevsky. Churchill relied on Allenbrook, Roosevelt on Marshall. Hitler trusted only Hitler. And the men who actually possessed the expertise to fight a continental war watched with increasing horror as he made decisions that, by all professional standards, should have been impossible. General Otto von Manschufel later summarized it quite directly. In his assessment, Hitler could track the movements of a single division on the battlefield, but the broader context, how entire armies functioned together, was beyond his comprehension. The historian Jeffrey Megagy expanded on this idea even further. According to Megagy's interpretation, what the corporal achieved was a victory against his own general staff, sacrificing strategy itself, favoring tactics and ideology over the professional military judgment that might have saved the nation. And Stalingrad perfectly illustrates that statement on the ground. In late 1942, the German Sixth Army found itself encircled on the Volga, surrounded by Soviet forces advancing from two directions. Every senior officer on the Eastern Front understood the necessary next step. Initiate a breakout, save the soldiers, preserve the army for future engagements. Hitler absolutely refused to permit any of these actions. He ordered Friedrich Paulus to maintain his position. He promised an airlift that could never have physically supplied adequate resources. On February 2, 1943, 91,000 emaciated, frostbitten soldiers surrendered to the Red Army. Fewer than 6,000 of them ever returned home. A dictator who prevents his best generals from saving his elite army is acting against his own interests. This seems impossible, unless the perceived interest was fundamentally different from what everyone assumed. It wasn't established to preserve the Nazi Party's rule. Its foundation was an extreme racial objective. Everything else stemmed from that sole critical element. The evidence lies in the most difficult part of this narrative to grasp. In 1944, with the German army faltering on two fronts, desperately lacking fuel, ammunition, and the railway capacity to transport soldiers and supplies to those still engaged in combat and dying at the front lines, Hitler rerouted trains to Auschwitz. The rail cars that could have transported reinforcements eastward were instead filled with Hungarian Jews and sent westward towards the gas chambers. The extermination was prioritized. The conflict followed. The war served as a method for the killing, not the reverse. No sensible administration operates in that manner, because no regime prioritizing its own preservation would ever behave that way. Every single action we have examined thus far, the lawful transfer of power, the stabilization within a defined sphere, the refusal to entrust the military to individuals capable of achieving victory, only makes sense when viewed through the lens of that fundamental reversal. The objective consistently superseded the regime's need for survival, and all subsequent events demonstrate what occurs when a leader is resolute in that conviction until the very end. A leader who makes no provisions for a future beyond themselves has, at a profound level, determined that such a future should not exist. Hitler lacked any children, grandchildren, or a ruling family poised to take over, nor were nephews being mentored or heirs secretly prepared. He designated a successor merely on April 29, 1945, in his final testament dictated mere hours before his passing. Initially Göring, then reluctantly Karl Donitz, following Göring's attempt to seize power earlier that month, almost as an afterthought to a decision he had evidently never wished to make. Contrast this with governing bodies established for longevity. The Kim family has now reached its fourth generation of leadership in North Korea. The Assad dynasty governed Syria for over 5 decades, spanning father and son. The Duvalier maintained control over Haiti for nearly 30 years. The Somoza family held power in Nicaragua for more than 4 decades. The Castro brothers led Cuba for over 60 years. Even Stalin, who eliminated anyone with a plausible claim to succeed him, left behind a political structure that endured for 38 years before the USSR eventually dissolved in 1991. Hitler's state collapsed in just 8 days. Donitz's interim government surrendered to the Allied forces on May 8, 1945, a little over a week after the fatal event in the bunker. Nothing was constructed with the intention of outlasting him because, on a subconscious level that scholars are still attempting to define, the endeavor itself was never meant to extend beyond his lifetime. And that conviction manifested in one final, terrifying way. Every other dictator who faced defeat attempted to escape. Mussolini fled towards Switzerland and was apprehended by resistance fighters en route, subsequently shot and displayed upside down from a gas station canopy in Milan. Ceausescu departed Bucharest by helicopter in 1989 as a crowd stormed the presidential palace. Saddam Hussein was extracted from a hidden crawl space outside the city of Tikrit. Gaddafi was discovered within a drainage pipe in Sirte. Mobutu, Marcos, Jean-Claude, Baby Doc Duvalier. All of them sought refuge in foreign nations and spent the remainder of their lives enjoying the luxury of other shores. Hitler, uniquely among them, remained in Berlin. More than remaining, on March 19, 1945, coinciding with Albert Speer's 40th birthday, he issued what historians now refer to as the Nero Decree. The directive was explicit and devastating in its scope. All German infrastructure, including bridges, factories, power plants, railway systems, food supplies, and water systems, was to be demolished before the approaching Allied forces could utilize them. He explicitly told Speer that if the war was lost, the nation itself deserved annihilation because it had proven itself inferior. In essence, the German populace was to face retribution for failing him, and then came a phenomenon unparalleled in contemporary history. Christian Goschel, in his research on suicide within Nazi Germany, documented a surge that is incomparable. A widespread self-inflicted demise among the regime's own officers and officials, which, in his description, has no equivalent in the modern historical record. 8 of the 41 regional Gauleiter took their own lives in 1945, along with 53 out of 554 Wehrmacht army generals, 14 out of 98 Luftwaffe generals, and 11 out of 53 Kriegsmarine admirals. Over 7,000 reported suicides were registered in Berlin alone during that year. Hitler's Walther PPK pistol and the cyanide capsule he used on April 30th were not anomalies within that trend. They represented the peak of it. There is one final inversion, and it leads in an unexpected direction. The perception most individuals hold of Hitler, as a disciplined ascetic, a vegetarian teetotaler, a monastic leader who abstained from all earthly pleasures for Germany's sake, was largely fabricated. As biographer Robert Payne articulated it, the image of asceticism was essentially a creation by Goebbels, intended to highlight the Führer's complete devotion to the cause. In private life, the reality was considerably less austere. Hitler consumed liver dumplings and drank diluted wine, and he maintained a long-term companion, Eva Braun, at his mountain estate, the Berghof. The public persona and the private circumstances did not align, and financially, they were completely different. Historian Chris Wheaton, in his book Hitler's Fortune, estimated the dictator's net worth on April 24, 1945, to be between 1.35 and 43.5 billion euros, based on 2003 values. Wheaton contends that at the moment of his suicide, Hitler was likely the wealthiest individual in Europe. The sources of his income were unsavory but immense. Royalties from Mein Kampf, which every newlywed German couple was essentially compelled to accept as a state-provided gift, generated millions. Royalties from the use of his likeness on German postage stamps were paid directly to him personally starting in 1934. An industrialist fund known as the Adolf Hitler Spend, Adolf Hitler Benefactors, funded annually by the nation's leading corporations, provided additional income. And according to declassified British intelligence documents from 2004, reported by the Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant, at least one undisclosed bank account existed with what is now the Dutch Postal Bank. The man who preached austerity to the German people was, in his personal affairs, discreetly amassing one of the most substantial fortunes on the continent. The only aspect of his public image that held genuine truth was his ideological conviction. And that conviction was ultimately responsible for the destruction of his own nation. Now let's consolidate the entire narrative. He was handed authority rather than seizing it. He maintained trust in the same inner circle for 12 years. He personally directed the war effort and ultimately lost it. He established no dynastic succession and devastated his own country during his departure. He took his own life in a bunker, surrounded by staff who had ingested cyanide. The persona that facilitated all of this was a deception. None of that is praiseworthy or admirable. This is the outcome when a regime is prioritized for a specific mission rather than for its own survival. Typical dictators are self-centered, which, in its grim fashion, is the very element that preserves their nations after their passing. Hitler's regime was designed to perish with him, and it led to the demise of somewhere between 60 and 85 million individuals. That is the definitive answer to the question posed at the beginning of this video. He stands in opposition to all other dictators because every other dictator, to some extent, desired to continue living. If the characteristic that makes Hitler unique as a dictator is also what rendered him exceptionally catastrophic, does that imply that every other dictator was, in their own grim manner, the safer alternative? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you for watching History of the World. If you found this video to be informative, explore our other in-depth analyses of the concealed history of the Third Reich. Please like this video, subscribe, and activate the notification bell to ensure you don't miss our upcoming upload. You found this video informative, so explore our other detailed analyses of the Third Reich's hidden past. We encourage you to like this content, subscribe to our channel, and enable notifications to catch our upcoming release.